Well, welcome to the Five Factors podcast. This week, we're having a conversation with Elliot Grudem about the importance that friendship plays in the life of a pastor. My name is Adair. I am an organizational consultant. I'm a leadership coach. I'm a pastor. And we've designed this podcast to be a conversation with you to help you build a great church and an even better life. One of the things that we know is that in order to thrive as a leader, we absolutely need friends. And that's because our work as pastors can be dehumanizing. It's isolating. It's not uncommon for pastors to feel angry, afraid, for us to be surprised, for us to feel sadness and shame about our work, about ourselves, about things that are happening in our jobs, about things that are happening in our personal life. So we need people around us who can encourage us. We certainly need to thrive in our relationship with God so that we can know who we are, that we belong to Him, to allow Him to encourage us. But He often encourages us through human relationships, our relationships with our family, our spouse, our kids, biological brothers and sisters, but we also need friends. But here's the thing. It is challenging for church leaders to have friends. It is an investment. Our time is usually taken up trying to serve other people, trying to make sure that we are investing in and helping our family to thrive. And so it's difficult for us to be able to make the investment oftentimes in friendships, but friendship is an investment that you absolutely cannot afford to not make. But it's an investment that most church leaders don't make. So I called up Elliot Grudem, who is a longtime acquaintance of mine and is a good friend to hundreds of pastors. He's the founder of Leaders Collective, which is a fantastic organization that really focuses on helping pastors build friendships with other pastors. So he is a pastor to pastor, so it makes perfect sense for me to call him up and have a conversation trying to help out me, trying to help out you, trying to help us out as we think about the importance of friendship and how friendships are built between pastors. So here's my conversation with Elliot Grudem. Here with the one and only Elliot Grudem. How are you doing?
Great.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. It's been far too long.
It has been. And so I'm imagining us kind of sitting across the table from each other. So if it's a mid-morning in Raleigh, North Carolina, where you are, what are you drinking?
Water. I've had 20 ounces of coffee, and that's where I try to limit it just to that.
So when you do coffee, are you taking it just black? Or are we throwing a bunch of stuff in there? I mean, how do you, are you bulletproof guy? How does it happen?
I can't get into the bulletproof stuff. No, it is black.
So I'm interested on this on the bulletproof side. You are somebody who has you have a refined palate for food.
Sure.
And so what's the struggle with bulletproof?
Nothing. I don't know that I've ever had it.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I don't think I have. Why would I want to add extra stuff to my coffee if it's already good?
Exactly.
I mean, if the butter is good, I could eat the butter by itself, right? Why do I need to mix it in and brew the coffee with it?
Yeah, it seems to be just simply then a means of convenience, and that's all.
Exactly it.
That's what happens and how it kind of jumps in there. I want to tell more of your story, and we've known each other for a little while, but I want to really start here with kind of the decision that you made to start Leaders Collective, and what was missing in the lives of pastors and church leaders that you were seeing that you were like, I need to help fill in that hole.
Yeah, I don't know that it was as much, that makes me sound a lot smarter than maybe I am. Leaders Collective started, I was at Vintage Church in Raleigh, and we were trying to figure out a way to get better at planting churches. And I was 100% convinced that the best way to plant churches, to prepare church planters to plant, was a focused time. It didn't have to be an actual residency type program, but some type of focused internships 2 week of a term, where there were men really focused on developing the individual church planter. And I saw some good models for that. The best model is Fellowship, still is the best model, Fellowship Associates in Little Rock, started by Steve Snyder and Bill Wellens and some other guys. And the challenge, as I saw that model, was that it was really, really expensive. So, developing church planters, you're not in a money-making business. You're not in guys that have a ton of extra resources, nor do they want to take on any type of debt because they're going into a business that's going to guarantee poverty for at least a short period of time.
Right.
And their salaries are always going to be capped at a certain level. And so went around to a couple friends and said, hey, I've got this model of developing church planters that I really want to put a real focus on longevity and helping them plant in a way that helps them stick around for the long haul. And what I had gotten was I'd gotten a hold of some research that Covenant Seminary, Westminster Seminary, and Reformed Seminary had gotten together and gotten some money from the Lilly Endowment, and study what does it take to keep pastors in ministry for the long haul. And they came up with kind of 5 characteristics that these pastors needed. And so I thought, what would it look like to train church planters around these 5 characteristics? Assuming the guys can already preach, assuming their theology is fairly solid, what would it look like to train them on these 5 characteristics? And so as I went to friends saying, hey, would you help me fund this? Other pastors, other guys that had planted churches, all about 10 years into the game, all had been successful to a certain degree, at least achieved more than they thought they ever would. They all to a man said, this is a great idea. We're in. I wish we could have done something like this ourselves. Yeah. And so, by about the 4th guy, it finally hit me. I said, why don't we start with pastors rather than church planters? And why don't we help them develop the skills that they need to kind of continue to pursue longevity, or maybe even start to pursue longevity as you've got 10 years experience, because if they don't last, it's going to impact the next round of church planters. And so that's really where it started. It was just kind of a number of friends saying, we don't know how we're going to make it the next 10, 15 years. We need some help. Can you help us figure out how to do that? And so we started to develop these cohorts for church planters of guys, experienced pastors, meet in groups of 6, 8 times a year over 2 years, once a quarter. And we walk through these kind of 5 themes of longevity together as a group. And so I don't know that it was necessarily seeing as much of a gap, though there was kind of my experience with Acts 29 let me see that a lot of guys were burned out. A lot of guys were kind of dying on the vine. A lot of guys were checking out, which means they were kind of overinvested in the image aspects of pastoring, reading good words on Sunday that they weren't sure had any real impact on their heart. Mm-hmm. And then, and some guys were disqualifying themselves just to get out of ministry without feeling like a failure. Yeah. And so there was that need for longevity, but I thought initially the best way to address it was the next generation. And what I've discovered is actually there's a whole lot of work to be done with existing pastors. Yeah. Coming alongside them and help them kind of figure out what they need to last for the long haul.
Yeah. What's interesting is that when Tal and I started building out the 5 factors, and we probably have been going for 6 months on this, like we put this together driving up to Chicago to see you too, mm-hmm. and just based on our experience and everything like that. And then about 6 months in, I come across Resilient Ministry, and I was like, oh, this is the 5 factors. Yep. And we just didn't even know that the research had already been done. So it's been a huge resource awesome. For us to be able to go back and see what people had already been done and just kind of confirmed that we're on this idea that, hey, if we don't help people who are leading churches invest in their health, then you're going to get into some situations that are going to limit your effectiveness either for the long haul or even on a daily basis. And so, one of those areas that when, I'm doing research and we're talking to people that we're connected with, different tribes, multiple countries at this point, one of the things that's always interesting to me is the fact that when I ask people, what are the things you're struggling with, the things that you're wrestling with, and we give them about 15 different options, almost always towards the bottom is friendship. Mm-hmm. So in February, Desiring God puts out an article that you write called Pastors Need Friends Too. And all of a sudden, it just pops up everywhere. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I mean, in some sense, it's a real simple. It's like we should have friends, but we don't have friends. Now, what should we do? But when you were writing it, or even as you saw it kind of come out, I mean, what jumped out at you in terms of why is this making the impact that it's making right now?
Why did the article make the impact that it's mm-hmm. making? Well, I mean, I think pastors are lonely. Pastoral ministry is an isolating job. There's a public isolation in that everyone thinks they know you, but nobody really knows you. It's a dehumanizing job in terms of most people are only excited about the role that you can fulfill for them. So can you preach a good sermon? Can you give me good advice, good counsel, do a wedding, do a funeral? Will you be there when I need you type of stuff? And again, it's only based on the role that you fulfill rather than who you are as a person. And then there's a personal isolation that pastors tend to pull back, and some of that is the nature of the job. There's just not, when most of your job is pushing against the darkness of sin, that can just get heavy.
Yeah.
And there's a heaviness to that sometimes, just for the sake of others, you don't want to share it. And so, my wife and I, we don't have any secrets between us, and she can know anything she wants. But there'll be times where she'll ask about an interaction I had, and I said, I'm willing to tell you, but just know, like, it's really dark, and I don't know that you're going to want to know what's going on here. And so that can kind of be some of that personal isolation. And then, pastoral ministry, criticism just comes. It's one of the occupations where many people feel the absolute freedom to come into your workplace and tell you how you should do it.
Yeah.
Pastors experience Yelp long before Yelp existed.
Yeah.
And so that can cause you to relationally pull back as well. And so, so pastoral ministry is by itself isolating. So that's number one. But the second thing is, there's this national loneliness epidemic that the former Surgeon General even talked about, especially among men, that men themselves are relationally isolated. And so you add, an isolating type of job, both in terms of what's required of you to stand up and kind of by yourself preach God's word and then fulfill different roles for people, the personal isolation that causes you to pull back, and then the fact that just for whatever reason, men in this day and age are not great at having friends.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're learning some reasons why as you're kind of interacting, working, trying to cultivate this?
Reasons why what?
Reasons why we're seeing this epidemic of loneliness among men in this generation, maybe that's distinct from past generations?
I don't know that I can speak to that. I can speak to what I see with pastors is there tends to be this, there tends to be kind of this emotionally, they tend to cut themselves off from their emotions. And again, it has to do with some of that dehumanizing role of the pastoral ministry that, again, you're only as good as the last thing that you did. And so there are times where in pastoral ministry, simply in terms of shepherding the flock that's under your care, right? Obeying 1 Peter 5. You've got to do stuff whether you're ready for it or not, or whether you want to or not, right? That's in season and out of season ministry. And so it can tend to, if you allow it or if you don't intentionally try to engage your emotions, it can make you kind of, what's the word? You can cut yourself off from your emotions, and so what it means is then, if you cut yourself off from your emotions, feelings, desires, you cut off a part of yourself, and you can't have a real relationship with only a portion of somebody's self. Pastoral ministry, especially in the world I traffic in, which tend to be more, kind of more reformed, the kind of reformed pastor world with a small r. It's highly academic. And there just isn't much within that world and among our tribe that deals with the emotions.
Right.
You ask somebody about kind of emotional health, and they point to B.B. Warfield's article on the emotional life of Jesus, which is helpful and really good. Yeah. But how old is that? That's 100 years old or something like that, right?
Yeah. Wasn't written yesterday.
It definitely wasn't written yesterday. That's a better way to put it. So there just isn't a lot of that. And then I don't know. We like precision. We like accuracy, and there can be a value to that. We like things in order, and emotions are a little bit messy. And so anyway, when you kind of pull that emotional piece out of it, it makes it really hard to have relationships. And then the other thing is relationships take time, and the older you get, the more time they take and the more intentionality they take. And so just to the point where you're starting to need more relationships, life and ministry is getting busy. And so it almost seems like relationships are not a necessity, but a luxury.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, when life calms down, then I'll actually start to have friends. And life never calms down enough for that to happen.
Yeah. So somebody reads the article, we'll link it up if in case somebody hasn't read it already, and they're going to go, okay, so get it, I should have friends.
Yep.
Honestly, I don't think I do. So what do I do now? So you've got a pastor,
Yep.
and let's say a church of 75,000 people, and he's been there 7 years, and is going, I don't have friends.
Yeah.
What do I do now?
Yeah.
What are you encouraging him to do in terms of next steps? What to do, what not to do? Coach him up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the first thing is what Psalm 133? How good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got to realize that that the relational side of their lives, so friendship, is good and it's pleasant, even if they've never experienced that before. Mm. So there's some faith in there.
Yeah.
And then second, Psalm 133 makes clear that that these relationships as brothers dwelling in unity is a gift of God's grace. And so it's less something that they have to force. What C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves says something like, we may think we're the ones that have chosen our friends, but in reality, God is the secret master of ceremonies, kind of behind the scenes, connecting the dots, or connecting the people. And so okay. So one, it's good and pleasant. Two, it's a gift of grace. Three, that when we have it, it is a gift, and so to be celebrated is something from God, not something that we've created. And then when we don't, it's the result of sin, and that's sin in us, sin in others, or just sin in the world. The world doesn't work the way it should, and sometimes that makes life busier than it really should be. So that's number one. You've got to get there. And then the second thing is Chip Dodd's a counselor in Nashville. He's got a book, The Voice of the Heart. And there he talks about one of the feelings we can have is loneliness. And he says that loneliness can be a gift from God if we engage with it, because it makes us realize that we're built for relationships. Mm-hmm. And so that when you feel the loneliness, it's not running from it, but engaging with it and said, okay, God made me for relationships. So that's the second piece. The third piece is you've got to realize that they're essential. Hebrews 3 tells us that without daily encouragement or exhortation from others, we're not going to make it in this lives, and our hearts will become hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And one of those hardenings that can take place is the belief that isolation is okay, or that I'm the exception to the rule and I can handle it without others. Yeah. So those are kind of the three kind of core things that they need to grasp and own. And then they need to work on deepening their relationship with God. And I would never assume that a pastor's got an intimate relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. So before we get away from that, because I think that's the kind of phrase that can everybody will head nod. When you think in your mind, when you say intimate relationship with God, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are the signs of a healthy relationship with God?
Well, there's an ever growing intimacy and love for God. I don't know. I would look at 1 John 1. John says that the relationship that he had with Jesus, we can also have with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that relationship that John had with Jesus was Jesus as a person, long before it was Jesus as a concept. Yeah. Absolutely Jesus is fully God, but he's absolutely fully man. And if you read the Gospel of John, you see that there is, a friend of mine, Paul Miller, puts it this way, John is absolutely fascinated and deeply, deeply, deeply in love with the man Jesus, in a really appropriate way. And so as pastors, we need to figure out, what does it look like to fall in love with not just Jesus God or Jesus concept, but Jesus as man. And what does it look like to really have that type of relationship with him, where there is ongoing, honest, heartfelt, pre-reflective conversation through prayer. And so, it's taking the models of the Psalms. Okay, so that's prayer to God. It's taking the model of the Psalms and finding that there's some really uncomfortable honesty that takes place in those conversations with God.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, I mean, look, the goal of engaging your emotions is not just to express them. Emotions are a gift of God that really are the currency of relationship. And so, what I'd look at is, in my relationship with God, are there emotions expressed? And if you don't know what those emotions are, or how to express them, well, then you've got in the gift of Psalms 150 examples of how to process with God in an appropriate way what you don't even know what you're feeling or how to give words to it.
Right.
And so, so I just, I'd start with that. I'd start with, if it's even in the most basic sense, I'd start with praying the Psalms. And what is, Don Whitney as an example, like if you don't like the one you're praying, skip ahead 7 or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
But start praying through the Psalms and start figuring out what is it like for these to actually give expression, honest expression to what I'm feeling. So that's number one, that there really is a deep, emotion-filled conversation with God.
Yeah.
Two, that there really is a deep, ever-deepening fascination with Jesus. Jesus is God and Jesus is man. And what is it like, when he calls his disciples friends? What is, kind of spend some time lingering over that, not just as a theological concept, but the reality of that statement.
Right.
And then, I'd say for pastors, that, make sure that there is time to build your relationship with God that has nothing to do with the ministry that you're doing.
Yeah.
So in other words, sometimes I'll encourage pastors to do a slow read through a section of scripture. And by a slow read, maybe a couple verses a day. And anytime their thoughts immediately go to, I need to preach it this way, or this would be good, to stop, pull back, even have a notebook where you can put that aside. It's not that's a bad thought, but stop, pull back, and linger over the scriptures until they really sense a heart engagement with it.
Yeah.
And then, the final thing would be, ultimately when you get to the right relationship with God, it's really ultimately a question of dependence. Do you know him well enough to depend on him?
Yeah.
And do you trust him well enough to depend on him and depend on him for absolutely everything? And the secret temptation that all pastors have is to get their church to a place where they don't need to depend on God for anything.
Yeah.
Enough money, enough people, enough whatever. And so is there that constant dependence on God, or are you looking to other things, including your own intellect, to manipulate the situation and get the pastoral, get the church to the place where you want it to be?
Yeah. Yeah, Dallas Willard's got a book out on Psalm 23 and kind of talking about this life without lack and the reality of how do you experience that in everyday life. And, one of these 3 anchors that he talks about here is the sense of faith. Is, do we understand who Jesus really is, and how do we live in light of that? And to notice that there are stages of development even within our faith, and how is that growing? It's so intriguing to me that when we get into this conversation about friendship, that it really is 2 sides of one coin. It's our friendship with Jesus and our friendship with other people. And our friendship with Jesus is going to help cultivate our relationships with people, and our friendships with people are going to help cultivate our relationship with Jesus. One of the things that you said in your article is you said, my encouragement, if you're trying to figure out where to start as a pastor looking for friends, is to start with other pastors.
Yeah.
I think that it's probably easy for us to hear that and go, yeah, I get that on some levels, but unpack that a little bit. And again, what I don't hear you saying is it has to be a pastor, but you're just going, hey, if you're looking to hack the system, just start here.
Yeah, and it's probably even more than hack the system. I mean, I do really think the best friends for pastors are fellow pastors. I don't want to get to the point where saying, pastoral ministry is so hard and so unique that nobody can understand it.
Yeah.
We all have challenges with our work. All jobs are hard. But there are some aspects to pastoral ministry that it's just a whole lot more fun to get with someone, give them a 2-minute scenario of what's going on, and then not have to explain all the reasons why we think that's hard, or why that's hurtful, or why there's just that kind of that, what again, C.S. Lewis calls that Me Too thing. I thought I was the only one. And so that's why I do think that, that fellow pastors are the best. The other thing about fellow pastors is I'd add a qualification that fellow pastors that aren't in your church, because then that gives you the opportunity to have honest conversations with them that sometimes pastors only have with their wives. And if your wife's your only friend, you're placing a burden on her that's far too heavy for her to carry.
Yeah.
And it's just unfair and unloving to her if she's the only one that gets to hear those kind of, those internal moments of frustration or self-doubt that or even questions about, okay, I see all of this happen. I believe God is sovereign, yet I can't quite make the connection between everything that's going on now and God's sovereignty, or God being a person that I can really trust.
Yeah.
That fellow pastors are the best ones to have those conversations with, because again, there's that me too, I thought I was the only one. There's a way that they can kind of normalize some of the suffering that's unique to pastoral ministry, or the challenges, or what as Andy Crouch talks about, the hidden vulnerability of leadership and strong and weak, that they can instantly understand that, and then they can come alongside you. And mature pastors aren't going to panic just because you say something that sounds a little bit out of line.
Right.
And so that's why I think fellow pastors are really the best place for pastors to start with their relationships.
Yeah, I want to dig into two things, because I'm imagining two conversations possibly happening for somebody who's listening to this. One is somebody here, you talk about a friendship with their wife, and like, well, see, I'm good. I don't need anybody else. I have my wife. Talk a little bit more about the limitations of our spouse being maybe our only friend, and why we need to continue to cultivate relationships outside of just that relationship.
Yeah, well, number one, I don't see that as I don't see anywhere that's the model within. So I'm trying to think in Scripture. There was at least a relationship, an honest relationship between Peter, who was married, and Paul, and between the other apostles, some of them who were married and some who were not. David has a relationship with Jonathan that seemed to have a real meaningful place in his life, that was outside the many other wives that he had. So there's some kind of screwiness to that, but
right.
And then just and practically though also, one of the things that Resilient Ministry, that book Resilient Ministry, came out with was that pastors are lonely, but their wives are probably even more lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons is, the phrase they used was, wives can often feel like a toxic, like a nuclear waste site, where they receive all this toxic information about the church and about their husbands, and they don't have anywhere to put it.
Yeah.
They don't have anything to do. And so I just say that kind of relying on your wife to be your best, to be your only friend, it's absolutely unfair to her, and it's a weight that's too heavy for her to carry. Because even practically, if she sees you in sin and wonders if it's disqualifying sin, and she's your only accountability partner, that's a really tough decision for her, because if she calls you out or brings it to someone's attention, like, you may not be able to pay your mortgage next month.
Right.
And so that's just not fair or loving to her. The other thing that's interesting, Sue Johnson is a marriage therapist and wrote a book called Hold Me Tight. And she talks about the couples that she sees in marriage counseling, which I imagine are probably, you've got to be in a pretty serious place to get to her. She said that one commonality between all the couples that she sees is that they're a community of two.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's that idea that, okay, we're each other's best friends, but we don't have anybody else to speak into our relationship. And just when you get there, there becomes this almost, just as individual isolation is bad. Well, now you've got this couple isolation,
right? And
you can wind up doing all kinds of just messy things and normalizing just bad behavior, either as a couple or giving each other a pass on sinful behavior, because they'll give you a pass on sinful behavior in this area. And it's just not the way God designed us to be.
Yeah. Second group of people I'm thinking about are the people who are thinking about their elder team or somebody else on staff, and thinking about the relationships, the friendships that are cultivated there. And I guess help us take an honest assessment at those relationships and the limitations that are there. I think we all know that, hey, we don't want to just show up and just work together. We want to have a relationship here. But, as you said, I don't even think it's hacking the system. I think it's important for pastors to have friendships with other pastors. So help the guy who's sitting here hearing this and going, but I got my elder team. I've got the other guys that are on staff with me, and we're friends.
Yeah.
I think I'm good.
Yeah. And, I'd say sometimes it's the pastor that says it. Sometimes it's the elder team that says, you've got us, you should be good.
Yeah.
Which is unfair.
Right.
Marty Heifetz and Ron Linsky in their book, Leadership on the Line, which is, I think, one of the best books on leadership for pastors to read. They're not believers, but it's tremendously helpful. They talk about the difference between confidants and allies, and that allies are those that you have a working relationship with, you're on projects together with. That would be definitely an elder team are allies. And there can be a relational familiarity and even a friendship to a certain level. But at the end of the day, there's still some kickback or there are competing interests.
Yeah.
And okay, job. All right, cool. That's one of them. But sometimes there are slight differences in philosophy of ministry.
Right.
That can come out and cause all kinds of conflict amongst an elder board. And they're not sinful changes. They're just slight differences in the way you're going to spend the last $10,000 you got in the budget.
Yeah.
And you can work through that conflict in a really good and healthy way. And I think it's good to work through those differences in that conflict, but that doesn't mean you always can be the best of friends.
Yeah.
On the other side, there are confidants. Those are relationships where there is no kickback. There's no competing interest. They've got, they really don't have anything in the game other than they just love you, and they're for you, and they want you to succeed. Yeah. And other pastors that aren't in your church, that aren't part of your elder board, that sometimes aren't even in your same town, can really, I think, provide that in a really good and healthy way. And again, back to that C.S. Lewis thing, me too, I thought I was the only one, that can actually help those relationships move along at a much faster pace than it can with just, someone else in your town, where you guys coach the kids' soccer team together. Even if they're a believer, that can only understand what you do up to a certain point.
Mm-hmm. So we have a pastor.
Yep.
Small town. We've brought attention to the fact, hey, you need friends. We brought some awareness. You need to really kind of drill into the biblical theological necessity of friendship. You as a pastor need to develop friendship with other pastors. Now, in terms of taking action, what are a couple of things that you would encourage them to do to go from awareness to action and beginning to move in a direction where, hey, 6 months, a year from now, they can go, hey, look, I have invested time and energy into cultivating a friendship with another human being.
You mean other than joining a Leaders Collective cohort?
Well, yes, which we will absolutely link up to. It's real simple, though, guys, leaderscollective.com. Right. But let's just say they want to do that in addition to developing something locally.
Absolutely. Well, I think I mentioned one other theological thing that I think is really important, and then there's the practical stuff. Ephesians 4, and I just stole this from Paul Tripp and Tim Lane's book, Relationships, A Mess Worth Making. But Ephesians 4 is Paul's, 1 through 3 is gospel, 4 is application, and it's all relational. That gospel application 101 for Paul in Ephesians is all relational. Yeah. And in verse 3, he has this, he writes this, here's what he writes in verse 3. And I remember reading it 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, and it just floored me. He talks about, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And the two words that jumped out to me were, one, maintain, which means that when I'm looking for friendship with fellow believers, I'm not looking to start something or create something. I'm looking to maintain something that Christ has created. That takes some pressure off. And then the second word that floored me was eager. Yeah. Oh my, wow, okay. There is, if I'm sitting here and just complaining about the fact, or feeling lonely and then feeling bad for myself, there is Paul's word to me in Ephesians 4 verse 3 is, I've got to be eager to do something about this. And so they need to figure out, what does it look like to kind of stir up that eagerness within them. And that eagerness is going to give them, I think, a greater commitment to pursuing it. Because if you're going to pursue it, there's going to be risk. Hey, I like you. Would you be my friend? And sometimes it's really as simple as that. There's going to be some intentionality that says, okay, if we're going to make this friendship work, we've got to make a commitment to get together and spend some time together on a regular basis. Where, especially with pastors, we're not talking shop.
Yeah.
Where there's this time where we're not just talking about kind of what's going on in our church. We're really talking about what's going on in our hearts and what's going on in our lives, what's going on in our marriage, what's going on in our families. What is the internal stuff that we're really struggling with. Yeah. And then kind of an ongoing commitment that says, hey, over the next period of time, we're going to commit, not just to this one intentional meeting, but as this thing progresses, we're going to make a commitment to see each other on we're going to put this on our calendar. Yeah. And it's not going to be a luxury. It's going to be, it's going to be an unbreakable appointment. Yeah. And then when you get together, it's going to require some intentionality too. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, it's not just a couple days together of just having fun, though fun's a part of it. Yeah. There's some intentionality, and it's really interesting. I keep quoting people, but I just want to make sure they're not just, it's more footnoting.
That's right. We're going to link all these up too, y'all. So, it's
all footnoting, lest you think these are all original ideas. Yeah. David Benner has a book called Spiritual Friendship. And he says that spiritual disciplines are the forgotten part of friendship building. And I've really actually found that true, especially among pastors, that there is something to going out and having fun and sharing meals and having good experiences. But there's something about an intentional, slow down prayer time together, or reading the scriptures slowly together, lingering over them, meditating on scripture together as a group, that just has a way of building the friendship. And I think that makes sense, because all we're doing, again, is maintaining the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And when we're focused on God in those relationships, we're reminded of what He's already done for us individually, what He's done for us corporately, how He's brought us together, united to Christ, united to one another. And that it tends to result not just in thanksgiving to God for what He's done for us, but thanksgiving to Him for the others that He's provided. Yeah. And when you give verbal expression to what you really feel about someone, or why you're thankful for them, and it's more than just, I'm really thankful for you as a friend, that tends to just kind of do something in terms of knitting your hearts together in a real meaningful, lasting way. Mm-hmm. And so I just, again, okay, so, risk, intentionality, commitment, and then the intentionality in your time together. And I would build in times of spiritual disciplines, reading scripture, praying together, not just as a God bless our time, but really kind of lingering in prayer over certain things or certain ways, or directed times of prayer, directed times of reading scripture together. That really tends to knit the relationship together and actually build that relational trust.
So what I hear you saying is, at some point in time, pastor in unknown small town who wants to have a friend, pick somebody at some point in time, and then you're going to have to make the ask. Absolutely. It's not you waiting for them. And it's probably, hey, however you shape it, you're essentially asking for some commitment and engagement, probably for a season, just to see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, because you and I both know how people are, it's like, well, how often should we get together? Is this once a week, once a month? And I'm kind of like, what's reasonable, like for both of you? I mean, some of it depends on context. And if once a week for 6 weeks works well, great, go for it. And then I think in that is like, hey, you probably need to include both, to use a Eugene Peterson phrase regarding the Sabbath of pray and play. You probably need to have some element of that. And those are going to look different, but spiritual disciplines in some aspect of where you're enjoying life together.
Absolutely.
And trying to basically use that as a foundation to see what's there. And it might be that it's not going to be your best friend for the rest of your life, but it might be. And this is a fairly simple way to just go, here's how you find out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, the fun part is that if there is that relationship with Christ where you view him as a friend, um, that though if that relationship with the other pastor doesn't work out as you had hoped, it's sad and it hurts and it's disappointing, and yet it doesn't have to be crushing.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's critical and vital when people go, yeah, one of the things that I think people probably don't pay enough attention to, and I'm glad you brought it up, is yeah, when it doesn't work out, where do you go and what do you do then? And you know, it's on to the next person in some ways, but there's a grieving process there. It's just like for
Absolutely.
whatever reason, the chemistry wasn't there, and that's sometimes hard. I think it's even harder on the person you're like, oh, of course we're going to be great friends and we have so much in common and this and that and the other, and then you just get in it and you're just like, no, it just doesn't go anywhere.
Right,
It's
and
painful.
yeah, and if it's a gift of grace, you're thankful for the gift that you had and the
Yeah.
person that you had. And some friends will be friends for a time and friends for a season, and rather than mourning that they're not friends for a lifetime, celebrate what the Lord gave you in a little moment.
Yeah, and for reasons that will probably contribute to some people hating this conversation, but they're still similar. Is we all got this advice when we were trying to figure out dating, courting, whatever it is we
That's
were
exactly
doing.
it. Yep,
It's like you didn't know that you know that you know that you know at the beginning of that relationship what it was
absolutely.
going to be, and there are a lot of things that contribute to that. And I could look back, you know, being here in Athens for almost 14 years, people that I was like, I think we're just gonna get along great, and you're just like, no, it just we're friendly, but
Yep,
there's no real genuine friendship. And people that I have relationships established with, I'm like, wow, I wouldn't have written it up that way, but here it is.
yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
When you think this doesn't come out of a vacuum, you know, anybody who is a proponent of things like health and friendship and things of that nature, that you don't just go, hey, I'm just going to look at what's out there in the market and go find how to fill a hole. There's something about your story and how that's connected. So when you think about your own story, where does friendship come into that, and why is it such a critical value for you?
Well, because I've known what I'm like without friendship,
Hmm.
and it's not good. And I can get myself when I isolate myself. Um, uh, I can wind up deceiving myself into believing or doing or acting in ways that are absolutely contrary to God's word. And so number one, it's an absolute realization that I need it. And the seasons that I felt it in pastoral ministry, I've just kind of, not the loneliness, but the loneliness, and rather than engaging with it, pulling back further into isolation, are some pretty bad seasons.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is that I've had some good, deep, wonderful friendships, and I've walked away from times with these guys where I've said this, I'm looking forward to getting together with them. We get together, and I walk away, and I say, "Man, that was even better than I thought it would be."
Mm-hmm.
And I've even had those guys come around me sometimes and saying, "Hey, even in the middle of doing Leaders Collective stuff, hey, you're the guy that's pushing pastoral friendship, and you're looking awfully isolated, and nobody's going to ask you whether or not you have friends because they're going to assume that you do.
Yeah.
But you've pulled back from us, and those have just been those just been wonderful, wonderful, wonderful times where they've come in, they've spoken that, and they said, what do we need to do to make sure we can find intentional time together? We can really engage with one another, and spur one another on to love and good deeds.
Well, and I think that's a place where it's helpful, because one of the things I was thinking is, I mean, if I've known you probably a decade, and we have lots of people that we both know, and I think one of the things that people would use to describe you is, Elliot's a good friend, and I think that we can almost throw that term around loosely, and so even trying to figure out how do I determine who I am friendly towards versus who is my friend. That's a challenge, but it's interesting. You kind of took in a direction that goes, no, I mean, like, I will isolate myself from people, and if I don't have friends, then I will just keep isolating myself. And so, that's an interesting reality in terms of the difference between a lot of us who are maybe wired to present as friendly, but we find ourselves in ways that we may not even be aware of, disconnecting the perception from the reality. And if we don't have those relationships around us, then we'll absolutely continue to present a public face, but what's going on internally and behind the scenes will look very, very, very different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, for me, a lot of it has to do with I'm a much better giver than I am receiver. I like to be, I like to be the one giving, not the one receiving. And that even relates to friendship. And so having some guys that I have good time with, that I have regular interaction with, that know me, one of them 17, 18 years now, we're into our relationship, that can see some of the nuances, and can kind of see through the initial response. Yeah, I'm doing fine. I'm doing great. Those are absolutely essential to me making it in the Christian life.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, again, if, Hebrews 3, my heart will become hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Mm-hmm. And I'll be really good at presenting a good exterior, while the interior is just an absolute mess.
So as somebody who struggles to receive, practically, like, what are some things that you have had to do in order to cultivate that, knowing who you are and how you're wired?
Well, I mean, one of it is telling people that.
Yeah.
And two, is just practically, learning to receive better. And telling people that when I'm in need. I had a mentor tell me, one time, I called him a couple of years ago, was just overwhelmed with life. And he said, I find when it's always important when I'm feeling that anxiety of too much to do and not enough time to get it done, is not just to think, what can I do, but who has God placed around me that can help me get done what I think he's done. I'm like, oh, shoot. Yep, he's absolutely right. And so just expressing that need. Sometimes that need comes out to these guys, just a quick text message. Here's what's going on. I could use your prayer. Sometimes it's a phone call. Hey, could you help me here with this? And really kind of learning that, what my dad says that, pride is thinking that you're the only one that can do it.
Yeah.
And so fighting through that pride and admitting need, and allowing others to serve. And then the final thing is being thankful for it when you receive it. Even if it's not exactly what you thought it should be, being thankful for it, because again, even that is a gift of God's grace.
Yeah. How about for the person who feels like they're asking for help? They're the person who's kind of the driver, that, they would say that if you look through my text exchanges, I'm the one who's initiating contact 90% of the time, and I'm starting to wear down a little bit. How would you encourage them in just this season of where there's a greater self-awareness that I'm doing this, I'm not necessarily getting the results that I want, and I'm growing in frustration?
Yeah, John Newton has this hymn, "One there is above all others, well deserves the name of friend." And it's, I think the very first thing you do is just engage with Jesus over that, and tell him about your hurt. Cause his is love without it. His is, I can't remember the words to the hymn, but the specific words, but it's, Newton, the next line is something like, his is love unlike another's. And his is love without end. And so I would, I'd take that immediately to Jesus, and I'd say, Jesus, you're the only one who's promised to never leave me or forsake me. And yet I'm feeling absolutely abandoned by everybody else. Would you meet me in the midst of this loneliness? And would you give me a friend? Mm-hmm. And just put it on him.
Yeah.
In other words, right, if he's a secret master of ceremonies, working behind the scenes to make this thing happen, just really express the honest, heartfelt, pre-reflective hurt to him, and then put it on him and say, you got to do something about this. And that may mean he changes you, or it may mean he changes others. But somewhere in that, you're not asking for something bad. You're just asking him to do what he's commanded you to do.
Yeah. Well, I want to give you the last word here in a minute. We've got people who are going to see this and see, a conversation about pastors and friendship, and they're going to tune in, having never heard of me or you. We've got people that have been listening to this podcast since the beginning or for the last few episodes, and but they're new to you and what you're doing with Leaders Collective. We want them to know about that. But I want you to kind of be able to just say, here's one thing. I've got one tweet, so now 280 characters, and this is like the one message that I want to encourage you with as a pastor, as a church leader. But before that, I just want to acknowledge you as somebody who is a friend, and I appreciate your wisdom. I appreciate your kindness, your generosity. There are a lot of people, myself included, that have experienced the fruit of your generosity, and I'm grateful for how many friends that I have and who have been a part of Leaders Collective, and this conversation has been a real gift for everybody who's listening and for me. So I'm grateful for you.
Thank you.
And for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. All right. So you got your one big Twitter billboard to go out to the universe. What would you want to tell everybody?
You're not going to make it without relationships.
There you go.
Yeah, we'll end it there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I appreciate you and grateful for what you're doing. And again, guys, Elliot Grudem, leaderscollective.com. And thank you so much, my friend. Really enjoyed
Matt.
it.
I appreciate it.
It was great. Well, thanks again to Elliot Grudem for being on this week's episode of the 5 Factors podcast. Again, the big takeaway for this week is for you and I to agree and to develop the conviction that friendships for us are a necessity, not a luxury. And again, if you remember in the interview, Elliot gave us a very simple strategy for developing a genuine friendship, is to look for another pastor in town and to just extend an invitation to sit down over coffee or over lunch to have a conversation about the possibility of spending time together and seeing if that connection doesn't develop into a friendship, that you actually find somebody who might be a confidant for you. And so it's a simple strategy that I think anyone can take action on. Most of us have other pastors that we are friendly with, so this might not be starting a brand new relationship. And matter of fact, I would encourage you to start this with somebody you already know and to simply strengthen a connection that you already have. And if you're looking for a network of pastors beyond just what you have locally, I'd encourage you to go check out leaderscollective.com, which is Elliot's company, the organization that he's developed to be able to help pastors develop friendships so they can thrive in leadership. It's a fantastic organization. I have a number of friends who have been part of Leaders Collective. All of them love it, and I believe that you will too. So go check out leaderscollective.com if you want to just build a wider network of friendships beyond what you have available to you locally. Again, I'm so grateful for the time that you have invested in this conversation. And for those of you who have been listening for a while, I'm really grateful for our audience and for the community that we're developing around the podcast. I'd love to ask you, if you haven't done so already, to go over on iTunes or go to 5factors.net/podcast and to go and to review the podcast. Leave us a rating. Let us know what you think about it. That's not only going to give us good feedback, it's also going to help more and more pastors and church leaders like you be able to hear conversations like this one week in and week out. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I'd encourage you to do that as well. That makes it really simple. You don't have to download any episodes. They just show up every Monday morning wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. So again, we're very, very grateful for the opportunity to serve you, to help you. We are absolutely committed to helping you live healthy. We're absolutely committed to seeing you thrive as a leader. So for myself, for Tal Prince, he'll be back soon. We'll see you on the next episode of the 5 Factors podcast.